Boarding began with first-class passengers, followed by active military, a policy I've always appreciated. As Max and I settled into our seats, I could see passengers filing past, many of them giving us friendly nods or small smiles. Word had spread through the gate area about what had happened, and the response was overwhelmingly supportive. But Captain Williams wasn't finished. As the last passengers found their seats and the flight attendants prepared for departure, the captain's voice came over the intercom system, clear and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Williams speaking. Before we begin our departure procedures, I want to address an incident that occurred in our gate area this morning." The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the flight attendants stopped their safety preparations to listen. A passenger with a legitimate, properly trained service dog was harassed by an individual who had no business being in the secure area of the airport. This individual questioned the passenger's medical needs, attempted to interfere with his service animal, and filed false reports with airport security. I could hear people shifting in their seats, murmuring quietly to each other. "I want to make something very clear," the captain continued. "Service dogs are not pets. They are medical equipment, as essential to their handlers as a wheelchair or a pacemaker. Interfering with a service dog is not only illegal, it's dangerous." The murmurs were getting louder now, and I could see passengers turning to look toward our section of the plane. The gentleman traveling with us today is a retired Army sergeant who served our country for 23 years. His service dog Max is a highly trained professional who provides critical medical support. They both deserve our respect and our gratitude. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the plane and spread forward and backward until the entire cabin was clapping. I felt my throat tighten with emotion as I looked down at Max, who was looking up at me with that calm, steady expression that said he understood exactly how important this moment was. But Captain Williams wasn't done yet. "I'm also pleased to report that the individual who caused this disturbance has been arrested by airport police for criminal trespassing and filing false reports. Airport security is reviewing how she managed to access a secure area without proper credentials." The applause turned into cheers, and I heard someone in the back shout, "Good riddance." Finally, Captain Williams said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, "I want to invite anyone who would like to meet Max after we land with Sergeant Thompson's permission, of course, to stay seated during deplaning. Max is a working dog, but I understand he's also quite friendly when he's off duty." As the plane pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway, I pulled out my phone to text my daughter Sarah. "Just wanted you to know that Max and I had quite an adventure this morning. Can't wait to tell you about it when we land. Max was absolutely perfect. I think Emma's going to love him." Her response came back immediately, "Dad, I saw the video. Someone posted it on Facebook and it's going viral. You and Max are famous. Can't wait to hear the whole story. Emma is so proud of her grandpa." Video? I looked around the cabin and noticed at least 3 people discreetly pointing their phones in our direction, all with big grins on their faces. As we climbed to cruising altitude, I reflected on the morning's events. 23 years in the Army had taught me that there are 2 kinds of people in the world: those who respect service and sacrifice, and those who think the rules don't apply to them. Karen or Linda, or whatever her real name was, had learned the hard way which category she fell into. The flight to Chicago was the most peaceful I'd ever experienced, and that's saying something for a man who's spent more hours in military transport planes than he cares to count. But this wasn't the kind of peace that comes from engines humming and altitude. This was the peace that comes from being surrounded by decent human beings who understand what respect looks like. As we reached cruising altitude and the fasten seatbelt sign clicked off, something remarkable began to happen. One by one, passengers started making their way down the aisle to our row. Not the usual airplane parade to the bathroom, but something I'd never experienced in 40 years of flying: a steady stream of people who wanted to acknowledge what had happened at the gate. The first was a middle-aged man in a business suit, probably heading to some corporate meeting in Chicago. He approached with the kind of careful respect you see at military funerals, like he understood the weight of the moment. "Sir," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you for your service. What that woman did was disgraceful, and the way you handled it was, well, it was something to see." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact. "Thank you. Max and I appreciate that." He glanced down at Max, who was lying quietly at my feet, still wearing his working vest despite being technically off duty. "My brother's got PTSD from Iraq. Took him years to get a service dog, and it changed his life. People like that woman, they have no idea what they're talking about. As he headed back to his seat, I noticed other passengers watching, some nodding in agreement. It struck me then that Karen's public tantrum had done something unintended. It had educated an entire plane full of people about service dogs and the invisible struggles that veterans face. The next visitor was a young mother traveling with a toddler who'd been eyeing Max with curiosity throughout the boarding process. She approached hesitantly, her little boy peeking out from behind her legs. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but my son keeps asking about your dog. Would it be okay if I explained to him what a service dog does?" "Of course," I said, looking down at the boy who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. "What's your name, buddy?" "Tyler," he whispered, still half hidden behind his mother. His mom knelt down to his level. "Remember how Mommy told you that some people need special help? Well, this nice man is a soldier, and sometimes soldiers get hurt in ways we can't see. Max is his special helper dog." Tyler's eyes went wide. "Like a superhero dog?" I couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, Tyler, Max is definitely a superhero dog." The little boy beamed and gave Max a shy wave, which Max acknowledged with a gentle tail wag. As they returned to their seats, I heard Tyler telling his mother in his loudest whisper, "Mommy, I saw a superhero dog." But it was the elderly woman who appeared about halfway through the flight that really got to me. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pinned back neatly and wearing a simple blue dress that reminded me of something my own mother might have worn to church. She approached slowly, using the seat backs for support, and asked the passenger in the middle seat if she could sit there for a moment. "My husband was a Marine in Vietnam," she said quietly once she'd settled in, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "He came home with wounds you couldn't see, and it took him 40 years to admit he needed help. I'm so glad you found Max." There was something in her voice, a depth of understanding that only comes from living with someone who's fought battles long after the war ended. I felt that familiar tightness in my throat that comes when someone really gets it. "It wasn't easy," I admitted. "Took me 3 years after the doc first suggested it before I finally applied for Max." She nodded knowingly. "Pride's a powerful thing, isn't it? My Harold, he used to say that asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Took our granddaughter asking him why he was so sad all the time before he finally went to the VA." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood that some conversations don't need many words. Max, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, shifted slightly and rested his chin on my knee, not in alert mode, just offering comfort. "How's Harold doing now?" I asked. Her face lit up with a smile that took 20 years off her age. "Oh, he's much better. Took some time, and he's got his good days and bad days, but he's learning to live with it instead of fighting it all the time." She reached over and gently patted my arm. "That's what that awful woman at the gate doesn't understand. She thinks she can tell just by looking at someone whether they need help or not. 43 years of marriage taught me that the deepest wounds are the ones nobody else can see." As she made her way back to her seat, moving carefully down the aisle, I realized that this flight had become something more than just transportation from Phoenix to Chicago. It had become a kind of rolling support group, a traveling community of people who understood that respect isn't something you have to earn by proving how broken you are. A few minutes later, a young business traveler who'd been sitting a few rows back came over. I recognized him. He'd been one of the witnesses to Karen's meltdown, standing near the gate counter when she'd been arrested. He looked to be in his late 20s, probably some kind of consultant or sales representative based on his laptop bag and rumpled dress shirt. "Sir, I need to apologize," he said, and I could hear genuine regret in his voice. "I was right there when that woman started harassing you, and I should have said something. I just didn't know if it was my place, and by the time I worked up the courage, security was already there." I studied his face for a moment. Here was a kid, and at my age, anyone under 30 is a kid who was genuinely bothered by his own inaction. That said something good about his character. "It's everyone's place," I told him. "But I appreciate you saying that. Most people would have just pretended it didn't happen and moved on with their day." He shook his head. "My girlfriend's been trying to get me to speak up more when I see injustice. She says that staying silent makes you complicit, even if you don't mean it that way." He glanced down at Max. "After seeing how that woman treated you and your dog, I think she's right." "Smart girlfriend," I said. "Hold on to that one." He grinned. Planning on it. She's actually a social worker, works with veterans in Chicago. She's going to be furious when I tell her what happened at the gate. As the flight continued, more passengers stopped by. A retired teacher who shared stories about students she'd had whose parents were deployed. A nurse who worked at a VA hospital and wanted to thank me for being willing to share Max's story. Even the flight attendants, during their downtime between service rounds, came over to chat and ask questions about Max's training. One flight attendant, a woman named Patricia who looked to be about my daughter's age, knelt down in the aisle next to our row during a quiet moment. "I've been flying for 15 years, she said, and I've seen a lot of ugly behavior. But I've also seen a lot of beautiful moments, and what happened after that woman was removed, the way everyone rallied around you, that's one of the most beautiful things I've witnessed at 30,000 feet. She glanced around to make sure other passengers weren't listening, then leaned in closer. "Between you and me, Captain Williams was angrier about that incident than I've ever seen him. He's ex-Air Force, and he takes service dog harassment very personally. That announcement he made wasn't just for the passengers, it was for everyone who's ever been in your shoes." The most touching moment came about an hour before landing, when a teenager who'd been traveling alone worked up the courage to approach. She couldn't have been more than 16, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from being in an unfamiliar situation. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, "I don't want to bother you, but I wanted to ask you something." "Sure, sweetheart, what's on your mind?" "My dad's a veteran," she said, speaking quickly like she was afraid she might lose her nerve. "He was deployed 3 times, and when he came back the last time, he was different. He gets really anxious in crowds, and sometimes he has nightmares. My mom keeps suggesting he talk to someone about maybe getting a service dog, but he says he doesn't want people to think he's weak." I felt Max shift beside me, his professional instincts picking up on the emotional weight of her words even though she wasn't his handler. "What's your name?" I asked. "Jessica." "Well, Jessica, you can tell your dad that getting Max was the strongest thing I ever did. Stronger than anything I did in the Army, stronger than any medal or commendation I ever earned." "You know why?" She shook her head, hanging on every word. "Because admitting you need help takes more courage than pretending you don't. And every day I work with Max, every time he helps me navigate a crowded space or alerts me to an anxiety attack before it gets bad, I'm not being weak, I'm being smart. I'm using every tool available to live the best life I can." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Can I tell him you said that?" "You can tell him more than that. You can tell him that Sergeant Bob Thompson from Phoenix says that real strength isn't about fighting your battles alone, it's about fighting them with the best backup you can find. And sometimes that backup has 4 legs and a wagging tail." As she headed back to her seat, wiping her eyes and clutching a piece of paper where she'd written down my words, I realized that Karen's ignorant outburst had created something beautiful. Every conversation on this flight, every moment of connection and understanding, was proof that most people are fundamentally decent when given the chance to be. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had tried to shame me for having a service dog, had attempted to make me feel like a fraud and a burden. Instead, she'd created an opportunity for an entire airplane full of people to learn about invisible disabilities, to understand the reality of PTSD, and to see firsthand what a properly trained service dog looks like in action. By the time we began our descent into O'Hare, I'd had more meaningful conversations about military service, PTSD, and service dogs than I'd had in the entire 3 months since getting Max. The flight had transformed from a simple trip to my granddaughter's graduation into a flying classroom on empathy, respect, and the power of community. As the wheels touched down in Chicago and the plane taxied to the gate, I looked down at Max, who had maintained his perfect behavior throughout every interaction, every conversation, every moment of what had become a 3-hour lesson in human decency. "Good boy," I whispered, scratching behind his ears. "You've done more education work today than some teachers do in a semester." Max looked up at me with those intelligent brown eyes, and I swear I could see satisfaction there. Not just because he'd done his job well, but because he'd helped bridge the gap between understanding and ignorance, between fear and acceptance. And as the passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, I realized that this flight had given me something I hadn't expected, proof that for every Karen in the world, there are dozens of people ready to stand up for what's right, to learn something new, and to treat their fellow human beings with dignity and respect. That lesson alone was worth the price of admission to this whole adventure. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, and I knew this was it. 23 years of military service, 2 tours overseas, and countless battles with my own invisible wounds, but nothing had prepared me for this moment. As I watched Karen's face drain of color, her mouth falling open like a fish gasping for air, I couldn't help but smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed through the terminal speakers, "before we begin boarding, I'd like to address someone in our gate area who seems to have forgotten what respect looks like." Karen, the same woman who'd spent the last hour mocking my service dog and calling me a fraud, suddenly looked like she wanted to disappear into the worn airport carpet. And that's when I realized this wasn't just going to be justice served. This was going to be a masterclass in humiliation, delivered at 30,000 feet. But let me back up and tell you how we got here. My name is Robert, but everyone calls me Bob. I'm 62, retired Army sergeant, and I've got more miles on these old bones than my 2015 Honda Civic. 3 months ago, my doctor finally convinced me to get a service dog for my PTSD and chronic pain, something I'd been stubbornly avoiding for years because, well, us old soldiers don't like admitting we need help. That's how I ended up with Max, a beautiful golden retriever trained to detect my anxiety attacks and help me navigate crowds. He's got more sense than most humans have met, and twice the patience. I was flying from Phoenix to Chicago that Tuesday morning. My granddaughter Emma was graduating high school, and wild horses couldn't keep me away. At my age, you don't take family milestones for granted. Plus, my daughter Sarah had been after me for months to meet Max, and I figured it was time. The Phoenix airport was its usual chaos that morning. Construction everywhere, delayed flights, and that particular brand of travel stress that makes everyone forget their manners. I'd gotten there early, old military habits die hard, and was settling into my seat at gate B7 when I first noticed her. She was impossible to miss, really. Mid-50s, bleached blonde hair piled high like she was headed to a country club luncheon instead of an airport gate. Designer purse clutched in one manicured hand, phone pressed to her ear with the other, speaking loud enough for half the terminal to hear her conversation about her very important business trip and how these people clearly didn't understand who they were dealing with. I've seen her type before. Hell, I've probably seen 1,000 versions of her over the years. The kind of person who thinks the world revolves around their schedule, their needs, their very existence. But at that moment, I was more focused on keeping Max calm in the crowded space and trying to stretch out my bad knee. The boarding announcement was still 40 minutes away when she first looked our way. I was giving Max his morning treat, part of his routine to stay focused, when I caught her staring. Not just looking, mind you, but that particular kind of stare that makes your skin crawl. The judgmental, squinty-eyed examination that says someone's already made up their mind about you. I nodded politely, the way you do with strangers in airports, and went back to my book. Some old Tom Clancy novel I'd read 3 times already, but it kept my mind occupied. Max was settled at my feet, his service dog vest clearly visible, doing exactly what he was trained to do, being calm and alert. That's when she made her first move. "Excuse me," she said, clip-clopping over in heels that had no business being in an airport. "Is that supposed to be a service dog?" The way she said "supposed to be" made my jaw clench. 23 years of keeping my temper in check during military bureaucracy, and this woman was testing those limits within 5 minutes of meeting her. "Yes, ma'am, he is," I replied evenly. Max's tail gave a small wag, because he's friendlier than I am. She snorted, actually snorted, and looked Max up and down like she was inspecting a used car. "He doesn't look like any service dog I've ever seen. Where's his special harness? And why isn't he wearing booties? My friend's service dog wears booties." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that means my blood pressure is climbing. But I've learned to breathe through it, count to 5, remember that not everyone understands how this works. Service dogs don't require any specific uniform, ma'am. Just proper training and certification, which Max has. She looked skeptical, like I just told her the moon was made of cheese. "Well, I just think there are a lot of people these days claiming their pets are service animals when they're not. It's fraudulent, you know. There are laws about that." The irony wasn't lost on me, being lectured about laws by someone who was about to break several herself. But I didn't know that yet. What happened next was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, the kind where you can see disaster coming but can't look away. Karen, I'd mentally dubbed her that within 10 minutes of our first interaction, had apparently decided that making my life difficult was her new hobby. She'd moved seats twice, each time getting closer to me and Max, all while maintaining this running commentary on her phone about fake service animals and people taking advantage of the system. "I'm telling you, Margaret," she said loudly into her phone, obviously wanting me to hear, "there should be some kind of test. I mean, anyone can just put a vest on their dog these days and claim it's medical. It's disgraceful." Max, bless his heart, remained perfectly calm. He'd been through professional training for 2 years and could probably handle Karen better than I could. Me? I was starting to feel that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that meant my anxiety was building. That's when Max did exactly what he was trained to do. He stood up, moved closer to my legs, and pressed his head against my knee as signal that he detected rising stress levels. "It's called deep pressure therapy, and it works better than any pill I've ever taken." "Oh, for crying out loud," Karen announced to anyone within earshot. "Now the fake service dog is trying to get attention. This is exactly what I'm talking about." An older couple nearby looked uncomfortable. A business traveler with his laptop glanced up with annoyance, but not at me. At her. Even a teenager with earbuds in was shaking her head at Karen's behavior. But Karen was just getting started. She marched over, and I mean marched, like she was storming enemy territory, and planted herself directly in front of my seat. "Listen, I don't know what kind of scam you're running here, but that dog is clearly not a real service animal. Real service dogs don't act like pets." "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level despite the fact that my hands were starting to shake slightly, "Max is a fully certified service dog. He's responding to my medical needs, which is exactly what he's trained to do." "Medical needs?" She looked me up and down dismissively. "What medical needs? You look fine to me. You walked in here just fine, you're sitting up straight, you seem perfectly healthy. What could you possibly need a dog for?" And there it was. The question that every veteran with PTSD dreads, the challenge that cuts right to the bone. Because how do you explain to someone that the wounds that matter most are the ones you can't see? How do you tell a stranger about the nights you wake up in cold sweats, or the crowds that make you feel like you're back in a combat zone, or the anxiety that can hit you like a freight train out of nowhere? "My medical conditions are private, ma'am, and protected by federal law," I said, which is the polite way of saying mind your own damn business. But Karen was having none of it. "Private? Protected by federal law?" She laughed, loud and sharp. "Oh, that's rich. You know what's against federal law? Falsely representing a pet as a service animal. That's a federal crime, mister." She was wrong, of course. Misrepresenting a service animal is usually a state-level misdemeanor, not a federal crime. But I wasn't about to give her a legal education in the middle of Phoenix Sky Harbor. What I was about to do was stand up and walk away, because I could feel my heart rate climbing and Max was getting more insistent with his alerts. But that's when she made her fatal mistake. Karen reached down and tried to pet Max. Now, you don't touch someone's service dog. Ever. It's like grabbing the handlebars of someone's wheelchair or snatching the white cane from a blind person. It's not just rude, it's dangerous. Service dogs are working, and distracting them can put their handler at risk. "Don't touch my dog," I said firmly, standing up despite the protest from my bad knee. "Oh, please," Karen scoffed, her hand still reaching toward Max. If he was really a service dog, he wouldn't want attention from strangers. This just proves he's a pet. That's when Max did something beautiful. Instead of accepting her attention like a pet would, he immediately moved to position himself between Karen and me, then sat in perfect heel position and looked up at me for direction. It was textbook service dog behavior, and anyone with half a brain could see it. But Karen didn't have half a brain. She had something better, she had audacity. "See?" she announced loudly. "That dog is clearly aggressive. Real service dogs aren't supposed to be aggressive. I'm calling airport security." And she did. Right there in the gate area, with a dozen other passengers watching, Karen dialed airport security to report me and Max for having a fake service dog and threatening her. As I watched her pace back and forth, gesturing wildly while she spoke to someone on the phone, I couldn't help but think about my granddaughter Emma. She's 17, about to head off to college, and she'd been so excited about meeting Max. "Grandpa," she'd said during our last video call, "I'm so proud of you for getting help. Max sounds amazing." That's when I reached into my carry-on bag and pulled out my folder of documentation. Max's training certificates, my medical paperwork, my veteran's disability identification, everything I'd hoped I wouldn't need but brought anyway, because I'd been dealing with government bureaucracy long enough to know that having paperwork is better than being right. And that's when everything changed. Airport security arrived in the form of 2 TSA officers and one very tired-looking airport police officer. The kind of men who've seen everything at least twice and have zero patience for drama at 7:30 in the morning. Officer Martinez, I caught his name tag, approached with that measured calm that comes from experience. "Sir, we've had a complaint about your animal. Can you provide documentation that this is a legitimate service dog?" Before I could answer, Karen inserted herself into the conversation like she'd been invited to the party. "Finally, I've been trying to tell everyone that this is a fake service animal. That man is clearly lying about needing a service dog, and his pet is being disruptive." Officer Martinez looked at Karen, then at Max, who was sitting perfectly at my heel in a textbook demonstration of service dog behavior. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let me handle this." But Karen wasn't stepping anywhere. "I know my rights. I know about the ADA. You can ask him anything you want about his service dog, and if he can't answer properly, you can remove him from the airport." Now, this is where Karen made her second big mistake. She was right that under the ADA, businesses can ask 2 questions: is this a service animal, and what task is it trained to perform? But she was dead wrong about everything else. Officer Martinez turned to me. "Sir, is this a service animal?" "Yes, he is." "What task is he trained to perform?" "Max is trained in deep pressure therapy for anxiety attacks and crowd navigation assistance for my PTSD." Simple, straightforward, and exactly what the law requires. Officer Martinez nodded and started to turn away, but Karen exploded. "That's it? That's all you're going to ask? You're not going to check his paperwork? You're not going to verify his medical condition? I demand to see certification. I demand proof." "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said with the patience of a man who's clearly had this conversation before, "what you're demanding would violate federal law. Service dog handlers are not required to provide certification, and asking about specific disabilities is prohibited under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Karen's face was turning red. "But he looks perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with him." And that's when TSA Officer Johnson, who'd been quietly observing Max's behavior, spoke up. "Ma'am, this is clearly a well-trained service animal. The dog hasn't moved from position, hasn't been distracted by the commotion, and is displaying textbook task-oriented behavior." I felt a surge of pride for Max, who was indeed being absolutely perfect despite having a stranger yelling near him for the better part of 20 minutes. But Karen was far from finished. "This is discrimination. You're taking his word over mine. I'm being discriminated against because I'm trying to protect legitimate disabled people from fraud." Officer Martinez sighed. "Ma'am, filing false reports and harassing passengers with service animals is a serious matter. I'm going to need to see your identification." "My identification? Why do I need to show identification? I'm the one who called you. I'm the victim here." That's when things got interesting. "Ma'am, you've made allegations about federal law violations. I need to document this incident properly, which requires your identification." Karen's entire demeanor changed. The righteous indignation flickered, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. I don't have to show you anything. I'm an American citizen. This is harassment." Officer Martinez wasn't budging. "Ma'am, you initiated this complaint. I need your ID for my report." After a long moment, Karen reluctantly dug through her oversized purse and produced a driver's license. Officer Martinez examined it, and I watched his expression change. He looked at the license, then at Karen, then back at the license. "Ma'am, this says your name is Linda Patterson, but you told the gate agent your name was Karen Whitman when you changed your seat assignment." The gate area went dead quiet. Even the baby who'd been crying in the corner seemed to sense the drama and stopped fussing. That's Karen or Linda," apparently stammered. "I use my maiden name for travel sometimes. For security reasons." Officer Martinez was now looking very interested. "Security reasons, I see. And you're traveling to Chicago today?" "Yes, of course. Why would I be here if I wasn't traveling? Can I see your boarding pass, please?" And that's when Karen made her third and final mistake. Instead of producing a boarding pass like any legitimate passenger would, She clutched her purse closer and took a step backward. I don't have to show you my boarding pass. That's private information. Officer Martinez looked at TSA Officer Johnson, who was already reaching for his radio. In 23 years of military service, I'd seen that look enough times to know what it meant. Someone was about to have a very bad day. Ma'am, you're in a secured area of the airport. Everyone in this area is required to have valid boarding credentials. If you can't produce a boarding pass for today's flight, I need to escort you out of the secure zone immediately. The pieces were falling into place like a perfectly executed military operation. Karen Linda, whoever she was, had somehow gotten past security without a valid ticket and had been harassing legitimate passengers in the gate area. This is ridiculous, she protested. I have every right to be here. You can't just throw me out because I complained about a fake service dog. But Officer Martinez was done with the conversation. Ma'am, you have 30 seconds to produce a valid boarding pass for today's flight, or you're coming with me. Karen looked around the gate area like a trapped animal, probably hoping someone would come to her defense. Instead, she found herself facing a dozen passengers who'd witnessed her behavior and were now looking at her with a mixture of disgust and satisfaction. That's when the gate agent, a young woman named Jessica according to her name tag, spoke up from behind the counter. Officer Martinez, I can confirm that there is no passenger named Karen Whitman or Linda Patterson on today's flight to Chicago. What happened next was better than any movie I've ever seen. Officer Martinez cuffed Karen, yes, actually cuffed her, and began escorting her toward the exit. But she wasn't going quietly. This is a lawsuit, she screamed as they walked past the boarding counter. I'm going to sue all of you. That man is a fraud, and you're all covering for him. That dog isn't trained. I know what real service dogs look like. Her voice carried across the entire gate area, and I noticed passengers at neighboring gates starting to look our way. In the age of smartphones, I had no doubt this was being recorded by at least half a dozen people. But Karen's exit wasn't the end of the story. It was just the intermission. As Officer Martinez and his suspect disappeared around the corner, the gate agent Jessica came over to me with an apologetic smile. Sir, I am so incredibly sorry about that incident. Are you and Max okay? We're fine, I assured her. Max handled it better than I did, honestly. I've already notified the captain about what happened. He asked me to tell you that you and Max will be boarding first, and he'd like to speak with you personally before departure if you're comfortable with that. 20 minutes later, as the gate area filled with legitimate passengers preparing for boarding, Captain Williams came out to meet me. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of steady bearing that told me he was ex-military too. Sergeant Thompson? He extended his hand. Captain Williams, I understand you had some trouble with an individual who shouldn't have been in the secure area. Yes, sir. Nothing Max and I couldn't handle, but it was unpleasant. Captain Williams knelt down and, with proper etiquette, asked permission before letting Max sniff his hand. I've got a German Shepherd at home, retired military working dog. These animals are incredible, aren't they? For the first time all morning, I felt completely at ease. This was someone who understood. They are, sir. Max has been a game changer for me. Well, I want you to know that what happened here was completely unacceptable. That woman had no right to harass you, and she certainly had no business being in a secure area without proper credentials. He paused. Would you be comfortable if I addressed this incident with the passengers during boarding? I think it might be educational. I thought about Emma, about all the veterans who struggle with invisible disabilities, about every service dog handler who's ever been questioned or doubted by strangers who think they know better. Yes, sir, I think that would be appropriate.